Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I'm very glad to kick off today's forum on climate change, which is co-promoted by ISPI and KPMG in cooperation with the OECD and with the support of Edison. This is the first of two thematic forums, with the second one on digital transformation to be held on May 16. And these two thematic forums will be followed by the Global Policy Forum that we are organizing together with the Bocconi University, the OECD, and Think20 Indonesia at the Bocconi University on June 2022. So today's forum, the title of today's forum is Rescue the Green Transition. Why rescuing? Basically for two strictly related factors, reasons. The first reason, of course, is in front of all of us, is skyrocketing energy prices. Last year, the gas price in Europe was 20 euros per megawatt hour. Today is 100 euro per megawatt hour. And the second reason, of course, is strictly related to the first one, is, of course, the Ukraine war, which is further increasing energy prices in Europe, which is redrawing the energy map in Europe and beyond. So these two factors, of course, are taking their toll on growth prospects worldwide. And when it comes specifically to green transition, it is not yet clear whether and to what extent these two factors will contribute to the green transition, will be an accelerator of the green transition, or whether they are going to be a brake to green transition. So inevitably, even if today we are all focused on the dramatic developments in Ukraine, this forum on climate change is more important than ever. And today we have the pleasure to have with us senior experts and personalities to talk about what is happening, what is left for green transition after COVID, and most of all after the Ukraine war. So without further ado, I leave the floor to the co-promoter of today's event, to Mr. Mario Corti, who is a senior partner at KPMG. Mario, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And I will start these few words of introduction by saying that climate change and green transition is a real existential challenge for humanity. I think it's necessary to say again this and to be all aware of the importance of this topic. Of course, we have some good news and some bad news on this topic. Good news is that the awareness on this topic is increasing. Investors clearly have in mind that for assessing a long-term profitability of a company, they have to embed climate risk in their calculation, in their assessment. But also regulators are very careful and have already embedded in their policy framework the climate risk, the climate change in their monitoring activity. So this is good news. But of course, there are also bad news. And probably the first bad news is that also by reading the last IPCC report, we are late. Probably the targets set are more and more difficult to be met. The 1.5 degree or below 2 degree is a difficult target. And we all should be fully aware of these difficulties in meeting this deadline. And of course, the other difficult issue is the war. The equation for managing climate risk was very complex before February 24th. Now is even more complex. We have an additional variable in this very complex equation. My perception is that in the short term, we see companies, governments are very much focused on managing the short-term problems, the contingency plans they are putting together. And this is fully understandable. But my belief is that in the medium term, the war will be an accelerator. The tragic events we are seeing will be accelerator for the transition. Because we have an additional reason for going in that direction. That is also a security issue. diversification of energy sources and having clean energy sources is an additional reason why we have to accelerate in this path. And we should probably start seeing this issue not only as a risk, of course it is a risk, but as an opportunity. And we should combine this opportunity with all the opportunity coming out from the innovation. Having an innovative approach will be key for going through the path and combining with the digitization of our society that we see. So the combination of digitization and green transition will be key for the success of this process. So seeing this as an opportunity means also that companies should embed in their strategies, in their processes, these very tough and very challenging goals. Probably a couple of points of attention in this part. First one, environment, climate change. If we want to be successful in this transition, we have to consider also the social profile. In the ESG, the letter E stands for environment, S for social. The combination of the two is key for the success in the green transition. First topic. Second one, EU Green Deal. The EU launched in the last month the EU Green Deal, and of course, I think it's even more important now to take a European perspective for managing the climate risk change. Having a common understanding, a common regulatory framework, a common investment in infrastructure. This will be key for being successful in this process. And last point is a more technical point, but I think it is important, is the issue of measurement. We have to set a common metrics for measuring where we stand, where we are going, because if we don't measure, we will never succeed, we will never reach our goals. Fortunately, after the COP26 in Glasgow, the International Sustainability Standards Board has been established. The goal of this board is exactly to set the metrics, and this will be key, because it is a technical issue, but not only. If we don't measure, we don't do, and the possibility to measure is critical also for having the right understanding of where the different companies, for example, stands, and having the right level of fair competition among the different companies. So this last point, I think, is an additional point of attention in this very challenging and long road ahead of us. But I will stop here. I will leave the time for the other discussant. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Mario. The applause is for you, of course. Thank you, of course, for joining forces with ISPI in this endeavor and others, of course, in the future. But now I will start with, because I really have the honor to have with us Enrico Giovannini. Enrico, nice to meet you. Buon pomeriggio.
Very nice to meet you. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yes, we can hear you very well. Enrico Giovannini, everybody knows him, of course, is the Italian Minister of Sustainable Infrastructure and Mobility. And Enrico, if you let me say so, you are also a friend of ISPI. This is the second time in a row that we are opening our forum on climate, and last year you were with us as the lead co-chair of our task force on climate when we were running the Think 20 Italy. So thank you very much, Enrico, for being with us today. It's really an honor, and I thank you. So Enrico, let me go straight to the point with the first question. Two black swans in a row. First COVID, then Ukraine war. Are they going to accelerate? Mr. Cotti was quite optimistic. He says maybe it could accelerate. But my question for you, for the Italian minister, is are they really going to accelerate energy transition in Europe, or are they going to push it off track? Please, Enrico.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you for the work that ISPI does together with others. Either we decided to throw away all the textbooks of economics, or the question that you are putting on the table is maybe requires a reformulation. If a price increases, the demand declines. This is one of the basics of economics. Of course, we could have bottlenecks, we could have liquidity constraints, we can have a lot of difficulties that can slow down this process, but this is one of the basics of economics, and I don't see why this time should be different. Let's go back to 1973, 1974, the first oil shock. People, and especially companies, manufacturing companies especially, changed the direction. Not enough quickly, not enough in general to avoid the problems that we are facing with climate crisis and so on. But anyway, this happened. Now, to be very at micro level, supposed to be the CEO of ITA Airways, the new company, air company in Italy. And you have to decide whether it would be better to focus the investments on buying new airplanes that consume 30% less than the previous ones, or decide to do something else. Fortunately, ITA decided to go for a big renovation of the fleet. And now, with new airplanes that cut down by 30% the energy consumption, may have a comparative advantage vis-à-vis the other companies who have a legacy of old planes. But I could make the same example for many other companies, and even for us, citizens. We have a big increase in energy prices, and we know that some people are deciding also, thanks to the end of the health emergency due to COVID-19, to go back to public transports, reversing the tendency that we have seen during the COVID period to use the individual cars. These are just few examples to say that I really don't see any reason, economic reason, price reasons, to slow down the process, and in particular, slow down the implementation of the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience. Of course, there are bottlenecks, and there are other financial constraints that can limit the capacity of companies to produce what is needed, for example, electric cars, or the construction sector to get the materials that they need to build the new railways or the new ports and so on. But this is not a political decision. It's just the shortages in terms of availability of raw materials. And we know that in China, for example, with the new lockdown, the Shanghai port is in trouble. In this perspective, let me say that I really don't understand those, and unfortunately in Italy we heard some voices that are saying that the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience has to be redesigned completely because of the war. On the contrary, we have to speed up. And just this morning, I was in a meeting with one of the Director Generals of the European Commission, who said that in few countries, not so many, this kind of message, slow down, emerged. But after a few interactions, in other countries, nobody is talking about this anymore, because the transition that the Next Generation EU and the national plans are envisaging are absolutely fundamental, even to increase our independency, autonomy in terms of energy. So we may have specific problems in specific projects, but I think that contrary to what some people wrote or said, we should speed up. And this is what we are planning to do.
course, this is absolutely important. I mean, there is no reason, as you said, to slow down. It's time to speed up. And sustainable mobility and infrastructures are key part of it and are key EU targets. All the more so in light of today's situation. So, are EU funding and existing projects fit for this purpose, or should we further raise our ambition in Europe and in Italy, in particular, since you are the Minister of Infrastructure in Italy? Please.
First of all, let me underline the fact that the Next Generation EU is not, let's say, financially, is not based on the targets expressed in terms of expenditures, but in terms of outcome. Which means that what we committed to do was not to build X kilometers of new railways, but it was to provide services to citizens by a certain date. This means that the whole performance-based approach of the Next Generation EU, of course, shouldn't change because some prices increased. But actually some prices increased and increased a lot. Therefore, we have a few options ahead of us. The first one is to compensate the additional expenditures due to higher prices with national funds. And this is what we are doing. This is what we are planning to do also next week, in order to allow all companies who have to launch the tenders, for example, for railways, to move forward in order to complete the new railways and to put them in service by the agreed deadlines. On the other hand, we recognize that the war and the new geopolitical situation may change some directions, for example, of international flows of goods and people. Just in a nutshell, if Europe will have problems in having, let's say, trade with East countries, Russia, maybe China, who knows, and so on, where else should the EU look at? The North, with the Arctic, not too many people living there just to stimulate the demand. West, of course, but the American continent is a little bit far away. I think that the answer would be South, which means Africa, which means India, which means also Balkans. In this perspective, Italy will have the possibility to play an even greater role thanks to the enhancement, enlargement, renovation of ports and railways, and the whole connectivity that we are planning with the National Plan for Recovery and Resilience and digitization, as it was said, in order to have an even stronger role, not only as an entry point for Europe, for freights coming from the Suez Canal, but as an exit point towards Africa and India and so on. But we need also to stimulate the production of some goods, especially in Italy, for example, in the so-called retroports, the economic special zones that we are financing in the south, close to the ports, in order to re-establish establish manufacturing activities that could look at Italy in the context of the reshoring or backshoring process that the war is stimulating after what the COVID-19 pandemic has done. So what I'm trying to argue here is that the strategic vision that we have put at the core of our national plan for infrastructures and mobility remain absolutely confirmed, even could be strengthened. And how can we do that? Is thanks to the work that we have done over the last year, reinforcing the investments foreseen in the recovery plan, 61.5 billion euro for our share of the whole plan, with more than 43 billion euro additional investments for the next 7-10 years in order to continue the work. And then I stop here. In few days, the so-called annex to the economic and financial document concerning the infrastructures and mobility systems will be published. There is a table there which show in a snapshot our overall strategy in terms of reforms, investments, and planning that go beyond the 2026. And these three pillars must be continued over time, and the overall investments can be even strengthened thanks to the use of the new regional funds, EU regional funds, but also the Fund for Development and Cohesion that has been already partially used for infrastructures and mobility systems.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giovannini. It is really a pleasure to have you again with us. Thank you for opening this forum on climate change. We wish you all the best for the great job you are doing for Italy and in the context of the European Union in the path towards green transition. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now I leave the floor to the real moderator of today's forum, who is Andrea Cabrini. Andrea is Managing Director of Class CNBC, which is our media partner, the media partner of today's forum, together with L'Economia of the Corriere della Sera. So now, thank you very much. We can leave the floor and we can start with the first session on scenario. Please.
Thank you, Antonio and Mario, for the introduction, and thanks to Minister Giovannini for giving us the sense on how governments are approaching the emergency. It's an energy emergency, but also we'll discuss climate change implication, what's happening. You know that since February the 24th, the world has changed, and the economic perspective, geopolitical perspective, and climate change perspective are changing dramatically. And every government is facing the same needs and the same challenges. But we'll discuss this now with three different sessions. The first one will be dedicated to the scenario. So how the scenario is changing. This has huge global implication, not just economic, but also social implication. And the second one will be about the key implication for climate change, the fight and policies against climate change in this current situation. And lastly, how about the future of energy transition, key implication on this. And then we're going to have a quick closing remarks just to get a bottom line of the discussion. We've got a terrific lineup of speakers. I can't wait to introduce them to you. I think there's a video just before the beginning of the session. Let's go with the video. Oh no, they are already there. Okay, so we can cancel the video from our rundown, and let me introduce, and all the speakers will be mainly from remote, so welcome to Mafalda Duarte, who's CEO of Climate Investment Funds, Ambroise Fayol, who's Vice President at the European Investment Bank, Helen Manfor, President of Climate Works Foundation, and Johannes Wienegand, Chief Development Issues Unit at the Strategy Policy and Review Department of the International Monetary Fund. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure having you. I would like to start this session about the scenario with you, Johannes Wienegand, because, you know, just a few days ago during the spring meeting, the International Monetary Fund presented its revision of the economic perspective, the outlook, the forecast for economic growth. And these forecasts have been reduced, I think, from 4.4% to 3.6%. And the main reason is that growth is decelerating and slowing down, mainly due to the impact of what's happening in Ukraine. Also, energy prices are at the core of the struggle of global economies. What do you think will be the impact of this economic slowdown and current situation also on energy transition and the main factors that are connected with the fight to climate change?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me fine.
Yeah.
Good afternoon to to Italy. It's morning in Washington D.C. So again, thanks for having me at this event. Let me start off. Even if you're an economist who works on climate and energy issues, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the energy transition is not the first thought. The first thought is the pointless human suffering, the destruction, and the fate of the people affected by the conflict. I think the second thought is about the global repercussions, especially on low-income countries. So we are talking about a food and energy crisis in many low-income countries, partly triggered by supply disruption as a result of the war in Ukraine, and these are very grave concerns. And I think you sketched them well in your introduction. They also affect very much our projections and were very much at the core of the discussions at the spring meetings. But to go back to your specific question, yes, of course, that is also a very relevant event for the energy transition. And the green energy transition, the switch from fossil fuels to low carbon energy forms, which of course is very urgent and remains very urgent, independent of the other circumstances. It's of course a very speculative question, what a conflict like that would do to the energy transition. Let me maybe break it down into three aspects, and that's by the time dimension. I think there's the very short term. Very short term is how do countries deal with disruptions or potential disruptions to energy supply that they hadn't sort of expected. And I think what you see there, for the most part, especially in Europe, is probably, if you put it into inconsistent with the green energy transition and more consistent with the transition, is probably in the more consistent package. Basically, countries go back to energy forms they have available. Some countries would rely more on nuclear. Some countries would speed up the transition to renewables. Others may go back to burning fossil fuels, but at least in Europe, I think from what we've seen in the past few weeks, the latter group seems to be relatively small, and politicians, if anything, see that as another reason to speed up the energy transition. Again, it may be different in other parts of the world. So in other parts of the world where energy supply is at risk, countries typically go back to what they have quickly available, and I'm afraid in some countries that may be coal and other fossil fuels. But I think if you ask me for the large picture, I would say it's probably on balance slightly more consistent with a transition with the green energy transition than less consistent. Then talking about the medium term, I think here we talk maybe about the next 5 to 10 years. I think what has come back to policymakers' calculus and wasn't on the calculus very strongly until recently is energy security more generally. So I think the assumptions that energy supply would typically be available without disruptions, that assumption sort of has turned out not to hold in this specific circumstance. And I think there's a realization that one needs to be prepared for these kind of circumstances. So if countries move to more secure energy sources, what does that mean? I think they would move to two things. They would move to things that they have domestically available, that they can produce themselves, they can develop themselves in the next 5 to 10 years, or they would move to energy imports from reliable sources, from countries with who they have friendly relations and stable relations, and where there's little risk of a disruption of energy supply from these countries. Now we have just started to do some analytical work on that and try to operationalize this concept of energy security, which also for us at the fund is, at least if it's not totally new, it's something that has been a bit rusty and that we need to brush off and bring up to date for our internal analysis. And it's too early to anticipate the results, but very cautiously, I would expect probably that in Europe at least, the transition should also, if anything, be helpful for the energy transition. I think we will see a speed up in the development of renewables. Many countries have produced specific plans or moved to other low carbon energy forms. There's really little talk for the medium term to go back to fossil fuels in ways that wasn't planned before the conflict. But again, that may be different for other parts of the world. Low-income countries, for example, if they want to ensure against energy security, will go back to what is domestically available. In many cases, that may be coal. And how the global balance of that looks is a different question as to how the balance looks in Europe. I would love to present you some results already today, but I think it's premature. We need to do significantly more work before we have, before we have something robust on that. And then the third one is the long term. And I think in the long term, ultimately what matters for the green energy transition is mitigation policies, and that will not change. So it will, the actions that governments take in order to decarbonize and switch to renewable energy forms, they will determine in the long term whether the energy transition is successful or not. And I do not think that the current disruptions really change anything about this calculus. If anything, I would be concerned that in the presence of very high energy prices at the moment, sort of the determination to move forward with the energy transition to increase the cost of fossil fuels, that this determination will weaken. And if that weakens, I think in the longer term, that is not good news for the global energy transition. Just a couple of talking points, and I will stop on that one. I think we have outlined a couple of quite a few times. I think from our perspective, what is required for that, we need to increase the cost of fossil fuels, ideally through some kind of carbon pricing that should be broad-based and that should encompass everybody. And we are well aware that these are not easy policies to do. They need to be accompanied by steps to ensure a just transition. They need to be accompanied by steps to make it attractive for large emerging economies to join the global effort. And at the same time, we do think that advanced economies need to spearhead the effort, because only if they move ahead, if they set strong incentives to the private sector to invest in renewables, create a market for renewable energy forms, I think we can expect that these things will continue to become more cost competitive, and in the medium term and longer term, take care of a large part of global energy supply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes Viehnegan. We open with the IMF position and outlook because, and thanks for emphasizing, the increasing tension between energy independence, energy security, and sustainability, and also how short, medium, and long-term vision of the energy transition are changing due to the disruption we are just living. And this is a challenge also for the continental platform that we're well ahead in terms of policies for climate change reduction and mitigation, like Europe. For example, in Europe, Fit for 55 was considered a very bold move, starting with the Green New Deal at the beginning of 2020. How things are changing here in Europe? Well, I introduced Ambroise Fayol. I was unaware of a last-minute change in the speaker for the European Investment Bank, so I welcome Stephen O'Driscoll, and sorry about that, I apologize for that, but Stephen, I would like to understand what's the climate bank of the EU, so the European Investment Bank point of view on the main troubles that Europe will face in getting to the targets in terms of climate change that were there and continue to be there from a climate standpoint, but energy is biting into the European economy. So how do you see the situation?
Thank you very much, Andrea. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, unfortunately, I'm not the vice president of the bank, but I'd very much like to be. Apologies on his behalf. He does send his apologies. I think Johannes has set the context there very well indeed. I think, looking at it from an EU perspective, there are three main obstacles or challenges that we face, if you like. The first is energy and food security. The second is really continuing to make sure that the green transition is a just one, and Johannes touched on it briefly there. And then thirdly, perhaps, is really maintaining the requisite level of coordinated ambition among our global partners to pull that green transition off. And if I just take each of these in turn, from an energy security perspective, the long-term answer, it's clear, to security of gas supply really has to be to reduce gas demand. through accelerated investments in renewable energy, and in addition to significant increases of energy efficiency measures in existing buildings and across heavy industry and so on. I mean, this is just patently absolutely critical. And then these areas, together with investment in electricity networks to support the electrification of the economy, these have really been the focus of the EIB's support to the energy sector for many years now. And that's even more so since the adoption of the revised energy lending policy in 2019. And since then, in fact, more than 90% of EIB financing, and of course, where the long-term financing arm of the EU has been in the energy sector, was dedicated to these particular priorities. And this is really how the EIB is supporting energy security of supply. On food security, the invasion has shown us the importance of ensuring food security at all times, not only just within the EU, but perhaps more so right across the globe. And the bank has a long track record already in investing in sustainable and resilient food systems, and we'll make sure that we further build on this in our response to the crisis. On the second point, accelerating the green transition while leaving no one behind. I mean, this was always going to be rather challenging, and I think it's probably even more challenging now. The invasion of Ukraine has forced the EU and our partners around the world to rethink our energy and climate policies. We've got to radically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And this economy-wide shift to clean energy, clean mobility, and to climate resilience really must be managed carefully to account for the inevitable social and economic consequences that it will bring. It must be a just transition. We recognise this at the bank, and that's really why one of our key pillars of the Climate Bank, which was released a couple of years ago, is just transition, and we're hoping to effect that in support of the €1 trillion of investment in green projects that we're hoping to make by 2030. I think for the EU, there's perhaps two other important dimensions. One is, in the search for alternative supplies of natural gas, as important as this might be in the short term, we must not lock ourselves into a new long-term dependence that requires heavy investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That would be costly, it would be catastrophic for the planet. The IPCC report has shown us that we've got to reach peak emissions by 2025. And we must look to the more climate sensitive options. And secondly, we must not trade one bottleneck for another by swapping our an over-dependence on fossil fuels for an over-dependency on raw materials needed for the green transition. These resources are quite heavily concentrated in just a handful of countries, effectively, not all of which hold the same values and interests as the EU. And so strengthening the EU's strategic autonomy and resilience must clearly remain a key objective of the transition. And then, as I said, we can't do this alone. We need to work with partners. And I think the invasion has really strengthened the strategic rationale for all the countries to reduce their fossil fuel dependence and invest more in climate-friendly energy solutions. And this is why the EU, more broadly, and the bank is actively engaged in climate diplomacy across the world. Yeah. We really do want to engage others and encourage others to raise their climate ambition. And we've committed considerable resource ourselves to working with partner countries so that they too can move to a resilient net zero emissions economy. And through the European Green Deal, which you mentioned, and the EU's new Global Gateway Initiative, EU institutions and member states are mobilising a significant sum of investment in green and digital infrastructure to address climate. Let's not forget biodiversity. They are inextricably linked, and the energy crisis. So through our new dedicated development arm, which is called EIB Global, we're now working with partners around the world to mobilise finance for energy efficiency, for renewables and electricity grid projects. And so just very quickly summing.
Yeah, I think, Stephen, that we might discuss this later on a bit in terms of the individual tools that the EIB use to finance the transition. But in a very nutshell, in a flash, Stephen, you mentioned reducing energy demand. And we know that the European Commission is working on a REPowerEU that will be presented later in May, and many expect that also some guidelines, including reducing heat temperature or the use of air conditioning or the velocity we travel by car or by bus, could be included on that, and individual governments, including the Italian governments, are starting to think about that. Do you think this could be effective, at least in the short term, to face, the challenges given the situation of the energy market?
Yes, I do, and the aspirational side of that is very good. But I mean, it takes some implementation as well. So let's see what happens then.
Yeah, all right, absolutely. Let me move to Helen Munford. So, Helen, we know that to meet the Paris Agreement targets, and the government should have rushed to reduce greenhouse emissions by kind of 50% by 2030, and even before the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, that was kind of difficult to get. And do you think we are on track? Do you feel like this situation, this energy emergency, will reduce the speed of the transition, or there will be more investments in order to get to those targets?
Thanks very much, Andrea. And the short answer to your question is no, we're definitely not on track as yet. We need to step up action and really do so urgently. And I think there's two questions here and two aspects that are important. One is how we are actually doing now, and are we heading in the right direction? And the second is, how do the latest commitments by governments, businesses, cities, and others, how do these actually add up? Are they putting us on the right track? And now we have, of course, this crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How does this actually shift the picture? Now, we have seen the latest reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which really is the leading climate scientists from around the world. And they're clear we're still going in the wrong direction, despite some signs of progress and some real opportunities here. So the window to avoid catastrophic climate change is closing rapidly. And every region around the world is already feeling the effects of climate change, whether it's heat waves or wildfires, extreme flooding, etc. And of course, the poorest countries and populations are those that are most affected and most vulnerable. But we are making some progress in terms of growing commitments to action on climate. And we're in a state where we think we have very few climate deniers left, certainly very few in government. That's been a big shift. We had, in the last couple of years, we've had 83 countries responsible for 74% of global emissions that have made net zero pledges. And if the countries actually meet these, we could keep temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. That's not yet enough. We're trying to cap it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. As I said already, now at 1.2 degrees Celsius, we're seeing major effects of climate change. So every fraction of a degree matters here. But even with these net zero targets, what we're seeing is the 2030 targets that countries have. As you said, by 2030, we need to have global emissions. But the 2030 targets aren't yet putting us on the right trajectory, not even on track for that 2 degrees Celsius, they're more. So we do have a sort of credibility gap and an ambition gap here, and need to step up these 2030 targets and put in place the right policies now to really put us on track. Now, as Johannes said, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this has really shown the world just how risky it is to be so dependent on fossil fuels. And the European addiction to Russian gas right now is actually providing the funds that fuel Putin's war. So we need to move away from this. There is a short-term challenge that Stephen and Johannes have mentioned, what we can do in that short term. And that's really important to avoid some of the energy shortfalls that Europe and others may be facing, particularly over this coming winter. But as we're looking to build out the new infrastructure, the new approaches for the medium term and to ensure future energy independence, this really is a moment when we can decisively double down on energy efficiency, on renewables, on electrification and grid modernization, etc. These solutions, the clean energy solutions, are now actually cheaper, far cheaper than fossil fuels. They would help avoid the millions of deaths we're seeing each year from air pollution around the world. and can help provide this energy independence. But there is a risk, and we're seeing this in a number of countries where we've started to see a licensing or an opening up for new oil, new gas exploration, new pipelines. Now, all of those are going to take years to actually build or to get energy from them. Over that same time period, we should instead be making this decisive shift towards renewables and clean energy solutions, and much, much more on energy efficiency and reducing demand using all the measures that you yourself just mentioned. This is the moment we can really reshape global energy systems once and for all, but we need to avoid that we slip back into the comfort and the sort of familiarity of relying again on fossil fuels, even if they're domestic. That will not be the solution that we need as we go forward. So it's an opportunity, but a risk too.
Yeah, absolutely. The risk is there, and as we tell about, day in, day out on the financial markets, we do see very strong capital flows towards the old and fossil fuels energy, new plants, new exploration, and so on. And this is also risk because those investments will basically go into new plants and wherever that, for a kind of a medium term, will impact also the fight to climate change. And with this, I move to Mafalda Duarte. Welcome again from the Climate Investment Funds. And my question, Mafalda, is how developing countries are playing their role in terms of the energy transition, and especially how the situation is changing after, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and what the main impact and changes and consequences can you see?
Buonasera, Andrea and tutti. I like Italian language.
That was great. Okay, that was very good beginning.
And thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there. It looks like a fabulous building that you are all in as well. Thank you very much for directing me towards emerging markets, middle and low-income countries, because I think it's very important. It's very important to look at the global picture. It's very important to look at what's happening in Europe in particular because of what's happening in Ukraine. But it's actually quite critical to focus on middle-income countries and low-income countries. And the reason for this is, and sometimes, it might not be so clear to the general citizen. Actually, developing countries represent the bulk of the population. They represent the bulk of global GDP, and they actually represent the bulk of the world's energy supply. And at the same time, it's in middle-income countries and low-income countries where the largest gaps on infrastructure investments exist across the board, across sectors. And we need to make sure that these investments align with our climate objectives and broad sustainability objectives. So according to some estimates from OECD, for example, already from a couple of years back, they had estimated around $90 trillion of investments needed by 2030 in sustainable urban energy, transport, water, and other assets, and 2/3 of these investments needing to happen in middle and low-income countries. So it's really important to pay attention to these economies. Now, what's happening in these economies is that they've just become a lot more challenged to meet these needs, and in fact, to deliver on their increased NDC ambition that they presented at the last COP. So already with the pandemic, the countries were being quite challenged. We saw for the first time in more than a decade a reversal in poverty reduction. So the actually poverty rates increasing. And we also know that this year, while the majority, around 90% of advanced economies are expected to regain their pre-pandemic per capita income levels, only 1/3 of the emerging markets and developing countries are expected to do the same. So we are going to be seeing a further decoupling of income per capita across these groups of countries. Now, my colleagues here in the panel have stressed this, the war in Ukraine and the impact on food and energy prices. I want to layer another dimension here. All of these are linked, of course. This is going to be, countries were already coming out of the pandemic with considerable debt burdens. In fact, we have a significant increase in the number of low-income countries and now at high risk of debt distress with the current war in Ukraine and the macroeconomic implications, inflation, interest rate rise. The expectation is that this will be further aggravated. And to layer on top of this, I think we also have to understand that these countries are already borrowing at much higher cost to meet their development obligation. And so while developed countries on average spend 3.5% of their revenue on interest on their debt, developing countries spend 14%. And another interesting metric is average interest cost of outstanding government debt is 1% for developed countries and 3% in developing countries. So we really have a situation where not only these compounding crises are disproportionately impacting developing countries, but they are in face of the pandemic, these shocks, they really are in a much more difficult situation to meet their development needs and their NDC ambitions. While we must have them, we must support them, do so, because as I said, they run on the majority of energy supply. So if we are to meet the Paris Agreement goals, if we are to meet our climate goals, we actually need to make sure that all of the pipeline of fossil fuel related projects are reverted into clean energy investments, for example. Yeah. So I think at this point in time, we need to recognize that a lot is needed to happen in North America and in Europe, but a lot is needed and conversations held on how do we support middle and low-income countries at the scale that is needed. With public capital, and this is where our experience comes in, with public capital, we have been providing low-risk, patient, concessional capital to these countries for more than 1 decade. We have seen that this public capital that brings the balance sheets of the multilateral development banks, brings private sector as well, and others, investment decisions are made that are not business as usual. Yeah. In very difficult, in fact, in very difficult context. 2008 was a difficult context. 2009 we were on the back of another crisis, and with this type of public capital and the right partnerships, we saw many investment decisions in middle-income countries and low-income countries shift towards clean energy. My final thought is, in all of these discussions in EU, in North America, having very clearly present the middle-income countries, low-income countries, and what a need for a sort of a solidarity package that is beneficial to all of us is very fundamental.
All right, thank you, Mafalda Duarte. That was very interesting, and also you left us with, the capital availability for these countries, and I think we should not also forget, when we look at the scenario, that financial conditions are changing rapidly. Central banks are raising rates, and the dollar is running at historic highs. So this will also impact. And I think it was really comprehensive, and thanks for all your hits, but we've got left just a few minutes, so we have to accelerate a bit. And so I start again talking about money with Helen Manford, because I remember at the G20 this kind of very difficult discussion to agree on 100 billion investment to compensate, developing countries and to allow them to move rapidly towards energy transition. First, do you think they're enough? And secondly, do you think there will be more or less money given, the new decision in terms of investing in defense, investing in different things from many governments? But just in a minute, if you can, for you and the rest of the speakers. Please, Helen.
Thanks very much. Very briefly, first of all, 100 billion is certainly not enough. We actually need trillions invested in actually shifting to a low carbon and much more resilient economy around the world. But that's not all going to be public funds. A lot of that has to be private investment as well. The sad thing is that at the moment, countries have not met that commitment on 100 billion. Latest OECD numbers suggest we probably got into about 80 billion per year, which is really far off where we need to be. So there's been a breakdown in trust there. But as we go forward, it is going to be important to meet that 80 billion, to move from that 80 billion to the 100 billion, and to also better use that public funding to leverage private finance. And I know, I'm hoping Mafalda will speak a little bit about what the climate investment funds are doing there, because that's an example which others can learn from. Now, again, one of the shocking figures, I think, is that at the same time as we missed this commitment on 100 billion, in the same year, countries around the world actually subsidized or provided tax breaks to fossil fuel production and use of something like 345 billion. So we're continuing to subsidize the bad while not also actually providing the investments and finance needed to help developing countries transition. So that will need to shift going forward.
All right, excellent. Thank you again, Helen Manford. And moving back to Stephen O'Driscoll, the European Investment Bank is kind of the climate bank for Europe. And do you think that your plans are going to change given the situation? I know that you can find yourself, on the market with a strong AAA, but there will be more or less money, for sustaining and investing in the energy transition looking ahead.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. I mean, what I would say is that, our role as the EU Climate Bank is really not a new one. We've been focusing on climate environment for a very long time, and we're actually the world's largest climate financiers. If you think back to the first issuance on the green bond market in 2007, that was from us, and we really had very ambitious climate targets since 2010. So what we're doing now is pushing on. We recognise there's an urgent need, and we're pushing on. And in 2019, we really did kind of take a quantum leap forward by adopting our new energy lending policy with even more ambitious climate environment targets. And in that, we said that we would phase out financing of all non-related fossil fuel energy projects, including natural gas. And then subsequently, we announced some even more ambitious targets, and these are enshrined now in our climate bank roadmap. So, what we said now is we'll increase our climate and environment finance to more than 50% of our annual lending. And when you consider that the EIB lends on average about 65 billion a year, these are quite substantial sums that are going towards green investments. We've also said that we want to support at least 1 trillion a year of green finance, 1 trillion by 2030. And this is to increase further the catalysing role that we have as a public bank. Taking Helen's point there, that we can play an important role in blended finance and leveraging in the private market as well. And actually, very importantly, and this is this really struck home. We said that we would align all of our new activities with the goals of the Paris Agreement by the end of January 2021. And we're actually the first MDB to do that. So since then, in terms of new instruments, we've launched our adaptation plan. We launched that at Glasgow, and that says that will triple the amount of climate action finance needed for adaptation by 2025. And we've also launched our Paris Alignment for Counterparties framework as well. So we're the first MDB now to consider not just the climate impact of the projects we finance, but also the wider activity of borrowers. So we really are pushing on now. I see time is running down there, Andrea, so perhaps I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and also Mafalda Duarte, given the energy shock on one hand and the economic slowdown on the other hand, do you think that priority in terms of investment to sustain the energy transition will change, especially in developing countries?
Yes, I think that's a concern as well. We've seen capital outflows out of emerging markets quite considerably already this year. And so in this riskier environment, the appetite for investment or for prioritizing investments in middle and low-income countries is going to go down. Therefore, the need for deliberation here, I agree with Ellen in terms of the public capital, the need for the public capital to be increased and quite targeted, and targeted in ways that have shown in the past that work, and we have some very good examples of what has worked in the past in terms of mobilizing the domestic debt market, in terms of trying to provide a push to the capital markets, green capital markets in these economies, bringing project developers as well. But I think we need to build on things that we have seen worked in the past, and also trying new structures and new vehicles that bring the institutional capital, which needs a scale, needs vehicles that bring scale to the market. We need to try new things as well. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to leave it.
Thanks again, Mafalda Duarte, Ioannis Vinegard. What can the IMF do to sustain a transition which has also a very important social consequences and to move towards a just transition? What's the role of IMF?
Yeah, so I'll keep it very short. So the IMF has a very clear mandate. The mandate is macroeconomic and financial stability. So we are, for example, we're not a development bank like the EIB. So we engage in climate change to the extent that is relevant for macroeconomic and financial stability. We published a climate strategy last year for everyone who's interested in that. The details of our areas of engagement in more detail. I think our main vehicles is especially surveillance, our Article 4 consultations with member countries. There we will make in the future systematically a topic the climate mitigation policies of the largest 20 emitters of greenhouse gases. But we also assist countries when it comes to designing policies to reach their mitigation commitments under the Paris Agreement, which has very significant fiscal implications in many places. Fiscal policies for climate change adaptation, often, as we heard earlier, there are significant investment needs and they need to be fit into sustainable macroeconomic frameworks. But also another big topic is fossil fuel exporters who need to diversify their economy going forward. We anticipate a drop in demand for fossil fuels, and of course that also has very significant macroeconomic implications. So I think our main tool to engage in these areas are surveillance, our policy dialogue with a number of countries. The topics you put in, just transition, I mean, I have not enough time to talk about this here, but of course they play a very critical part in these consultations as well. Beyond that, the IMF does capacity development, assists countries with several challenges that come up in the context of climate transition, as it pertains, for example, to fiscal policies, to budget planning, to public financial management, and so on and so forth. Also stress testing of central banks against climate risk, for example, is an area where we are quite active. And last but not least, we just set up a new facility, the Resilience Sustainability Trust, during the spring meetings, that is meant for lending to address longer-term challenges and longer-term climate change adaptation. So far, we've just set up the legal framework that we hope to operationalize it in the coming 12 months. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Thank you again, Ioannis Vinegard. And thanks to all the speakers of the first session dedicated to the scenarios. And this is the round of applause from the Palazzo Clerici, Milan, to all of you guys. Thank you, Mafalda Duarte, Stefano Driscoll, Ellen Manford, and Ioannis Vinegard. Actually, just plenty on the table to discuss. So we're ready to move to the second session, but now with a video, an introductory video, if the gallery is okay with that. All right. Okay, we're ready to go with the second session. And first, I want to welcome Noura Mansouri, who's here in Palazzo Clerici in Milan, and she's research fellow at the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Saudi Arabia. Welcome, and thanks for joining us physically here in Milan. And we have connected from remote Mike Hayes, Global Decarbonization Hub Lead and Global Head of Renewables of KPMG, Rachel Kapka, Executive Director of the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, Anthony Young, and Regional Director of the Global Center on Adaptation, and Lola Vallejo, who's Director of the Climate Program of the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. Thank you, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start with Lola Vallejo with kind of a simple remarks, because we still remember at COP26 all the discussion and the divergence between some of the most developed countries and developing countries, and very tough discussion, actually, that impacted also the outcome, the final outcome of COP26. Do you think that what's happening after the Russian invasion in Ukraine will exacerbate this kind of asymmetry and divergence between countries in terms of how to fight climate change?
Thank you very much. I think probably when you think back to what happened at COP26 in Glasgow, if you think about divergence, what grabbed a lot of attention towards the end of the conference was a disagreement about the issue of having a coal phase out or a coal phase down. And some emerging economies, including China and India, for instance, were pushing very hard to have a coal phase down instead of a phase out. So I think that grabbed a lot of headlines. I think it's also one of the small things that's happened at COP, and there's a lot more that could be said. Clearly, we need to phase out coal, and we need to phase out all fossil fuels. It makes sense to start with coal because it pollutes twice as much as gas. But I think what the latest war in Ukraine has shown is maybe broadening the spotlights, not just on coal, but also on oil and gas. And I think even at the time, China and India were saying, your focus on coal is also a way to avoid talking about the developed countries' reliance on oil and gas. And if you look at the energy profile of many countries, it's fairly true. The growth right now in China and India is really driven by the domestic production and consumption of coal, which still plays a huge share of the energy mix. Whereas Europe and the US, which are also a huge producer of oil and gas and actually the largest producer globally, it really puts in stark focus that we need to broaden the conversation and talk about phasing out all fossil fuels. I think what's interesting with the current situation is that obviously the war in Ukraine is a tragedy in so many respects. I think it's also shedding a new light on what we mean by energy security, because in the past I think the argument of energy security was used as a way to slow somehow the transition away from fossil fuels, especially for countries which had domestic production capacities. But now we see that energy security and climate action are actually somehow realigning themselves, because some of the things that we can do to lessen our reliance on Russian oil and gas, which are currently being considered, are also very aligned with climate action. We need to considerably increase our push for developing renewables capacity, but also design cities and invest in public transport in a way that lessen our reliance on individual cars and trucks. So really imagine different ways of moving people and goods. And we also need to retrofit buildings. So build buildings differently and retrofit existing stock of buildings so that we use less gas for heating, less electricity for cooling. And as it's been said in the previous panel, is going to become a bigger challenge as heat waves are going to become more frequent and more severe. So I think that's an interesting way to view the current situation.
And to look at that. And thank you, Lola Vallejo. And Rachel Kapka, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, last week said this is a crisis inside another crisis, meaning that we were still fighting the pandemic when the energy crisis came out with this war. So we know that also threats to global health can arise from climate change, and there's a very clear correlation between climate change and global health. But we don't talk so much about that. Can you give us your view on this side of all the transition we're discussing?
Sure, absolutely, and thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today. So when we think about global health, it's really critical to put a few things in perspective, which are, first off, it's much easier to garner attention and therefore drive action when problems pose an immediate risk. So as a global community and, the human species, we're not really so very good about responding to future threats because they're not tangible. Two, when it comes to public health, we need to look at what are the major health problems. Now, it turns out there are many, and as you're pointing out, many of them are quite linked to one another. We need to let the science guide our decision-making and response. And so many governments did exactly that during the pandemic. But we aren't seeing such a strong response for other health risk factors for premature death and disability. So take pollution, which is my third point. Pollution is an issue that's intrinsically linked with climate change and health. And pollution as a whole, so that's contaminated air, water, and soil, has been causing 9 million premature deaths a year. And very little is really going on to prevent and solve it. Of course, a big portion of those deaths come from air pollution, which has many of its sources in common with climate change, principally the burning of fossil fuels, which we're talking about here. The World Health Organization just came out earlier in April saying that 999% of people are regularly breathing polluted air. So air pollution, at least is sometimes visible, right? We can actually see it in the air. And there are a lot of monitoring networks set up in many countries. But there's also a whole swath of invisible toxicants, heavy metals, especially lead and mercury, chemicals that the majority of people do not know about. And it's so bad now that scientists are saying that we're actually born pre-polluted, right? It's so bad now that 1 in 3 children globally under age 5 are lead poisoned. And lead is, probably the best known toxin to humankind. It comes here we are in Rome today. It's well known from the time of the Romans to be a pollutant. And lead has just these horrible, permanent, irreversible health impacts on babies and children, and continues to have impacts later down the line on adults in terms of cardiovascular impact or neurodegenerative disease. So what we see looking at the data is that we actually already have a very alarming situation that too few people are worried about and that too few people can see, at least enough to really move the needle. The Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, of which I'm the executive director, is publishing an update to the Lancet Commission on Health and Pollution in May 18th in Lancet Planetary Health, saying pretty much exactly this. And while some countries have made progress, by and large, not only has the globe not made progress on these issues, but pollution, and especially modern pollution. So this is what we're talking about here today, the things that are caused by industrialization, urbanization, the same drivers of climate change, is actually getting worse. And not only that, but it's really offsetting many of the gains that we have made in other areas of public health improvement. And fourth, and I'll end with this, the health impacts from climate change in terms of burden of disease are really inadequately measured currently. We're only able right now to measure deaths in terms of weather-related events or by proxy from deaths from air pollution. But there's nothing on a death certificate that's going to say that your mother or father or whomever, your child, died from air pollution or climate change. There's only one example that I know about, which is that very tragic case of the 9-year-old from Southeast London, Ella Adukisi Debra, whose family lost their little girl to air pollution in 2013. So as a global society, we measure what we care about. And right now, no one is feeling the pain or voicing that pain that environmental health risks have for us, because this is not really how individuals or lawmakers or doctors or politicians measure death, disease, and disability.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Rachel Kapka. Let me move now to Africa. We know that climate change has asymmetric impact, meaning that countries that produce less carbon dioxide emissions are the ones that suffer the most of the consequences of this in terms of climate, clearly, in terms of the economy, in terms of, for example, in Africa, in terms of drought, desertification, erosion of lands, and so on. So it's connected to health, clearly, but it's also connected on what's happening after the beginning of the war in terms of food prices. The index of the Food Agriculture Organization ramped up and skyrocketed in just 2 months at the highest level in history. And this will definitely lead to also social instability. So Anthony Nyong, what do you think is the link, the connection between what's happening, what you can foresee, and the efforts to adaptation to climate change that were underway in Africa?
Yeah, thank you so very much for the invitation to participate in this event. It's always very interesting in sessions like this to hear the global efforts being put to minimizing emissions, on the race to zero, carbon neutrality and all that. That's excellent. But what we fail to understand or have not put in enough thought into is that even on that race, on that road to carbon neutrality, there'll be a lot of casualties. And the casualties be largely on those on the front line, like you've seen. Africa is on the front line, and the most vulnerable sector is agriculture. But 90% of our efforts, resources, and things globally go into driving down emissions, forgetting these vulnerabilities of this very large group of people. The IPCC 6th assessment report has said it, that yes, the amount of CO2 locked in the system right now is enough to continue to cause havoc in Africa over the next 2 decades. So it's quite important. And like you've mentioned, without the Ukrainian crisis, Africa is already in a deep situation concerning food security. We've seen that from 1961 till now, we've seen a drop in crop productivity by about 30%. And then we've seen that as we speak, at least 20% of Africa's population faces hunger. And that, to me, is right there a problem. And most African countries are net importers of food. We spend about $45 billion importing food. This is a continent that's largely made up of very poor countries. So that's the situation we have. And wheat imports account for about 90% of Africa's 4 billion annual trade with Russia, 90% of it, And also, it accounts for nearly half of the continent's 4.5 billion annual trade with Ukraine. So when the war now came on board, it further exacerbates the crisis that we're seeing. We're seeing an increase in the price of wheat by about 45%, and fertilizer about 300%. This is substantial because we are looking at, a 20% decline in the continent over the value of our food. And that's about $11 billion we're looking at here. So that's significant. But what does this mean? We are seeing that our adaptation efforts are insufficient grossly. We were not ready for when COVID-19 came. None of our adaptation models and scenarios ever predicted or imagined that COVID would come. We are trying to deal with that, and there hasn't been a moratorium on climate change. COVID came. There hasn't been a moratorium on COVID. The war in Ukraine has come. And this war has largely exacerbated our food crisis. Not only that, it's also affecting the flow of climate finance into adaptation and resilience, maybe generally into climate change, because we realize that that's the first thing that goes when there is an additional extraneous crisis. Climate finance goes down. We face more important things. So what we're saying currently is, while it is important to address the issues of Ukraine, let's please not put climate change on the burner, because the impacts will be serious. Imagine having refugee crisis because people can't eat. There's malnutrition added to the refugees created by the Ukraine crisis. I think nobody is going to come out better off. So what we are doing at the Global Center on Adaptation is that, one, we're building resilience into initiatives that we're involved in. initiatives of development finance institutions. For us, we've developed with the African Development Bank a $25 billion facility that will accelerate adaptation on the continent. And that looks at the nexus between climate change, COVID-19, and the entire economy. And that entire economy will make scenarios for this sort of hazards and shocks that are coming in. So we need to put more attention to our adaptation efforts. We need to ensure that the resources that we have do not develop wings and go somewhere, and that we will continue to sustain the issue of adaptation. At COP26, interestingly, many countries came up and said they are doubling adaptation resources, which is very good. That was before we saw what is happening in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Can we maintain that pledge to continue to double the adaptation pledges because of the crisis that African countries are facing? So our adaptation needs to be more robust, and agriculture needs to be paid special attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony Nyong, also for reminding the importance of the effort on adaptation, which will be the key, one of the key. And the disruption of the war is clearly creating a challenge also to all the efforts that were underway, even if they were limited, as Anthony Nyong reminded us. Now, Noura Mansouri, you come from Saudi Arabia, which everyone knows is one of the biggest exporters of oil in the world, and many people would like Saudi Arabia to export more currently, but they're maintaining their production. At the same time, I would like to understand from your experience or work and perspective what the Gulf states are doing or willing to do in terms of energy transition. How do you see this?
Thank you, Andrea, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, ISPI, for the invitation. Thank you for this important question. Indeed, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf economies have embarked upon the energy transition a long time ago. Saudi Arabia specifically have, showcased environmental stewardship, despite being a global oil producer and one of the largest oil producers. It has kept sustainability and environment at the heart of its operation. Especially since the 70s, when it has decided to stop flaring the gas and instead have established a hydrocarbons industry and petrochemicals industry, which have provided energy to the world for so many decades and have powered civilizations and humans. There have been so many efforts. Evidently Saudi Arabia have announced its net zero target by 2060 and have announced many initiatives in this roadmap towards net zero. Particularly the circular carbon economy, which Saudi Arabia has proposed during the G20 2020 summit, and it was endorsed by all the G20 countries. This framework shifts the discussion really, as it should, from the energy sources to managing the emissions, as enshrined in the Paris Agreement in Article 4. So it allows countries to participate in the energy transition based on their national circumstances and the national endowments. So it keeps all the options open for the energy transition. In last October, Saudi Arabia has also announced the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative to plant 40 billion trees across the region and 10 billion trees in Saudi Arabia. This is through this afforestation effort. It hopes to mitigate climate change and offset the carbon emissions. There have been also many announcements, actually more than 60 initiatives with a price tag of 700 billion Saudi riyals. Saudi Arabia is home to the world's largest carbon capture, utilization and storage facility. And this is an important innovation to allow the participation of the hard-to-abate sectors. And the hard-to-abate sectors are responsible for over a third of emissions globally, and it's important for these sectors to participate in the energy transition using innovations such as CCUS and hydrogen. And speaking of hydrogen, Saudi Arabia plans to be home to the world's largest green hydrogen plant in the futuristic city of Neom to produce 650 tons of green hydrogen daily. There's also been the world's first shipment of blue ammonia from Saudi Arabia to Japan, and this is evident how oil can be used in a clean way, where it's produced in where the blue ammonia is used in power plants in a clean way. So there's been all these developments and announcements in addition to the Net Zero Producers Forum, which was established together with the US, Norway, Canada, and Qatar, who together make up 40% of the production. So all these pledges really show the seriousness of pursuing environmental sustainability and really leading the way in energy transition.
Well, definitely, it's interesting what these Gulf states can do and will do in the future, also in the field of new energy and not just the traditional fossil fuels. Very interesting. But let me move also to renewable with Mike Hayes. Now, Mike, we discussed also in the first session the fact that given the short-term energy emergency, there's a new flow of investment towards fossil fuels, but all the reports from the Energy Agency, International Energy Agency, and IRENA, the renewable agency, already were saying also last year that we were underinvesting in renewable versus what is needed. How do you see the situation today? The level of investments, is that enough? Or what can be done and what kind of tools can be used to invest in renewables today?
I think the short-term measures will involve increased investment in fossil fuels, but the message globally is very, very clear. And I think it was one of the earlier speakers who said what has really happened is an alignment between the security of supply issue and the carbon agenda. I mean, that statement should be reinforced right throughout the session. That, for me, is a game changer. And Anthony spoke about and he's absolutely right, about the adverse impact of COVID-19 and Ukraine on adaptation. I want to come back to that separately. But in terms of the renewable energy agenda and the push towards more renewables and deploying renewables quicker, there's a separate issue which I'll come back to in the developed world. But in the developed world, and if you look at the recent EU statement, they make it very, very clear the long-term ambition, and the long-term starts very, very soon once we get over the immediate crisis. The long-term future is about renewable energy, and not just wind and solar. It's about storage, it's about green hydrogen, and if you read the papers, nuclear is very much back on the table again. So the real challenge, I think, facing those of us, and I practice in renewable energy and work with developers and investors, they all say the same thing. They say, this is a game changer. This is the biggest and most important policy signal we've got for a long time. The issue in deploying greater renewables is not, and I emphasize, it is not a lack of capital in the developed world. The real issues that are prohibiting us today is underinvestment in grid infrastructure. We really need to start rethinking how we invest in grid, and we need to embrace the idea of private ownership of grid and infrastructure very, very quickly. If we're going to move vast amounts of renewable power, particularly offshore in places like the North Sea, into Europe, then I think we have a very, very significant challenge on grid. The European Union, in their policy statement in March, also highlighted the length of time it takes to get planning and development approvals. That now has been earmarked, and that, for me, is a very, very important initiative. And the other area that I am passionately convinced that we need to talk about at every single session on climate is innovation. The sooner we really start supporting the ecosystem of innovators, the better for me. So there are some of the challenges in the developed world, but I'm broadly positive, and we will get there. When however, I spend a lot of my time working and looking at some of, how can we replicate the success we've had with renewable energy certainly in Western Europe and the US, right across developing nations. And I come back to the question of capital. We need to figure out how to convince investors to take more risk to invest in high-risk developing countries. And there's a number of problems here. Investors sometimes perceive risks that don't actually exist. There are some solutions in the public sector which are available. So there's a big piece of work that needs to be done to actually inform and educate private and institutional investors globally that A, there's opportunity to invest in renewable energy in developing countries, but that B, that they're looking at risk in not quite the right way. There's a number of initiatives that are up and running around this. I'm involved in one, which I think is a great initiative involving the International Energy Agency and the World Economic Forum. It's a thing called the Cost of Capital Observatory, where we're looking at some of the factors that are driving the high cost of capital for some of these regions. So I think that's an important initiative, but I think there's more that needs to be done to educate the investor class. So, Andrea, if I stand back and look at your question, I mean, renewables is definitely going to be part of the future. We have logistical and infrastructure problems to solve in Europe and the US, but we really need to crack how we mobilize more capital to drive a renewable energy revolution in developing countries and address some of the issues that Anthony raised.
Well, absolutely, Mike. Just in a nutshell, is it just about money, capital, or also authorization and processes? In many countries, we know very well the Italian experience, where potentially we've got plenty of projects that are being halted by bureaucracy, basically. And what do you think, is this a global problem or just individual countries?
It's a global problem, but I think what's really interesting, when the European Union and the EU Commissioner decided to react to the security of supply issue, they released this very, very important policy statement called REPower EU. It's well worth a read. You know, calls out the short-term fossil fuel measures will be required. It makes it very clear about the long-term trajectory being low carbon. But in particular, there is a standalone section in that document which talks about the approvals, particularly the planning approvals. So now I'm really encouraged by this. Now they've recognized it is not a capital question in Europe. It is a process and an approvals issue. If they can get over that, the money is there, the developers are there, the technologies are there. It's now very much an effort to address some of the policy shortcomings that we have. And I think that is a very, very important step.
Yeah, absolutely. That's crucial. And just to report what's the voice of the industry. In Italy, as an example, they're asking for a commissioner to make a more simple and fast way of authorization for all the new projects. We shall see, because just over the weekend, there will be a new energy decree from the Italian government. Everyone is looking very carefully at that. Now, let me move back, and we've got a very quick kind of second round of questions, Lola Vallejo. And we discussed, you know, the tough and difficult discussion that were at COP26 and also inside the G20 in the past. Climate change is a global issue. It takes a united world to tackle a global issue. Reality is, the world is more and more divided, and after the war, also from a geopolitical stand, you know, tension is growing everywhere. So what do you think that the G7 countries can and will do to support developing countries in their decarbonization processes?
Thanks a lot for this great question. I think maybe the first thing to note is that the credibility of the G7 in decarbonizing at home is also very important, because it sends the right policy signals, but it can also have a bigger impact in terms of, you know, trickling down economic benefits. So for instance, Germany investing massively through feed-in tariffs in the solar industry meant that the cost of solar then plunged and was a lot more accessible as an energy worldwide. That's just one example. I think also investing in the green economy, and we've talked about innovation, and you know, it's an opportunity for having a clean industry, and it's a big selling point of the transition, in particular in Europe. But we should be mindful that the G7 has a particular responsibility of creating value chains that include developing countries. So developing countries do not just want support in the form of aid and cooperation, they also need to industrialize in many cases, and they would like to have space for doing so in the new economy that we're building, hopefully in a greener way. So for instance, one instrument that EU is pushing, and France in particular is pushing for, is a carbon tax at the borders for carbon-intensive products. So if you design it in a way that does not recognize the efforts that some countries could do to develop a green industry, then you're not being true to the mandate of this particular policy instrument. So let's make sure that this is fair. And the last thing, and it's really major, the G7 are the richest country. The whole multilateral climate action forum is based in solidarity and commonality of destiny, almost. We made a commitment to provide $100 billion per year in climate finance, and this has not been met. We're really looking forward to having this commitment being met. It's the bare minimum for ensuring there's, a global global momentum to decarbonize. That's the very premise, and that's not even talking about issues around existing losses and damages from climate change, which is an open topic for cooperation internationally.
And let's hope that the political confrontation underway will not interfere too much or prevent this to happen. Rachel Kapka, you were mentioning pollution, and we know that mega cities, the super cities, are kind of the center of creating pollution. And what do you think can be done or is underway in order to reduce the impact of mega cities and the way we live into mega cities in order to create a more healthy environment?
Yeah, thank you. City governments really have it tough. They're responsible for millions of people that live in them, and yet they may not have all the tools or the political authority or the funds or perhaps the spheres of influence to really make the changes that they need to improve pollution to protect the health of the citizens of their cities. So they need to work really closely with many different actors, many of whom are not just restricted to that particular city itself, and many of whom are in national or regional government agencies and in sectors or industries, private sector, to have an impact. The good news is that solutions available are really tried and tested and have worked in many cities around the world. So our first recommendation is to really work out what are the sources of that pollution and identify the options to be put on the table to reduce it. So it's important to remember that you don't have to have an incredibly fancy or robust monitoring system in place for air pollution, for example. Yes, we need basic data, but not having a really robust system in place for monitoring should not prevent action. Getting into specifics is really the next step. So looking at which problems a particular city has that has both an impact on health as well as air pollution and climate change. The Global Alliance on Health and Pollution did a really great analysis on the intersection of these two and the best solutions. So obviously getting rid of coal-fired power plants tops the list no matter which way you look at it. Replacing fossil fuels with clean sources of energy is absolutely key. Cutting out dirty diesel is critical. Moving electric buses and electric vehicle fleets, away from fossil fuels to clean energy or electric is very important. And one that we haven't talked about yet today is open burning, especially crop burning. This really tops the charts too. So strategies and that really happens outside of the city. So that talks to those points that I was saying about how difficult this can be.
Yeah.
All of these solutions have really high benefits for health because they reduce particulate matter 2.5. These are the really tiny particles that cross into the blood through the lungs. And these solutions also, of course, reduce CO2 emissions. Another just small point, which is, nature-based solutions, which have been the focus of prior discussions, are really nice. They sound great. They make everyone feel good. And they can be really good options, especially in low resource settings, because they're affordable. And that's really important for low and middle income countries. But we have to remember that these are Band-Aids, right? The most important thing we can do to address pollution at source is to stop it from happening in the first place, period. Right. And then we need to clean it up if it's not going to clean up on its own. And that's particularly the case with heavy metals, lead in particular. These types of elements will continue to persist in the environment for generations until they are cleaned up.
All right, that was a great point, Rachel. Thanks again, Anthony Nyong. We discussed, climate finance with the European Investment Bank. We discussed with the Climate Investment Fund. But how about green financing in Africa and any chance to make it easier, the access to green finance in the continent? What do you make of that, and what's the situation currently?
Hello, that's me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much again. when I hear about decarbonization in Africa, I get worried because decarbonization presupposes a carbonization, and Africa is not, and does not, and will not carbonize. When you look at total emissions from 55 African countries, less than 5% of total emissions. Energy is less than 2%. The rest is from deforestation, poor agricultural land uses. But the whole argument and discussion is on energy transition. We on the continent were looking for energy, at least let it drive our growth. Not that it must be any form of energy. We need to see how do we deal with the low-hanging fruits? How do we move people from firewood, from fuel woods into something cleaner? How do we move our manufacturing from coal, which is there? And so Africans know, yes, we are trying things on renewable energy technologies. There is a massive drive to install solar PV cells and so on. But we know that these are not capable of driving our industries for now. They're very intermittent. The storage capacity is not there. And Rachel, you said something about lead poisoning. I can tell you that much of the lead poisoning we find in Africa come from the renewable energy technologies because we don't have battery manufacturing plants in Africa. We don't have battery buyback policies. So when we buy these batteries from China and others, 2 years, they're dead. What do? The children go in there, the informal sector, and they break these batteries and extract the lead to sell. There is absolutely no protection. So we're seeing this happening around. And what we're saying is, let Africa transition. They are saying gas is a transitional fuel for us. But the world is saying, no, gas is fossil. You cannot do it. So what are the options that we have, if not to remain in darkness? I just lost power now for the past maybe 30 minutes. I was praying that let it come in so that we can continue this. I'm using a battery, How do we access finance? There isn't any global interest in supporting Africa's efforts not to deforest. There isn't enough interest to finance good land use practices. And I'm saying this should change. Where we have access, they're either concessionary loans or national budgets. So Africans are having to borrow money to deal with situations they never created or caused, whether it's concessionary or not. This is where they are facing. So what we've done on the continent is public resources alone cannot deal with this. How do we really encourage domestic resource mobilization? We've established what we call the Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change that brings together all our players in the financing sector. Low carbon development efforts is good for us as a continent. Let's pursue it. Climate resilient development pathways are good for us. Let's pursue it. And what should these institutions do? We have a lot of money on the continent in national banks, development banks, commercial banks, sovereign wealth funds, name them, insurance companies. So, but the problem has been, how do they see the investment in this space? All we talk about climate change is doom and gloom, and everyone runs away. What are the opportunities that will bring the private sector, that will bring the financial institutions there? It's not the doom and gloom stories. So we are recasting Africa's narrative that there are investment opportunities and a 3 billion investment market for private sector to come in. We are hoping, and we're actually seeing preliminary results, that more people are now coming into that space to finance adaptation and mitigation efforts on the continent. If we continue the rate at which we are going, Africa currently programs just 3% of total climate finance in the world. If it was a division tournament, we probably would be playing in division 50. If it's just 3% for what we stand for the resources we have, for the opportunities we have, 3% is an embarrassment because people are not paying attention to the African continent. And we are hoping that one day we won't turn around and realize that Africa has become another China, doing their own thing, polluting so much. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. That's what a very crucial point to remind us a different way at looking at carbonization, decarbonization, and the fight to climate change, and also what the priorities might be and should be in Africa in terms of what to finance. But let me move again. We are going to wrap it up to Noura Mansouri, because what we're experiencing is kind of a trade-off between transition and the harm to the economy, which in the short term we're living and everyone is concerned about. And I know that you've been working on carbon circularity also as a way to prevent, transition to harm economic growth. Can you tell us more on that?
Yes, Andrea. So this question touches upon the classic debate of that was reflected in the very first definition of sustainable development as it appeared in the Brundtland Report in 1987. So balancing economic growth with social prosperity and environmental sustainability. And it was evolved in the Rio Convention, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the balancing between the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Sustainable SDG 7 on energy access and SDG 13 on climate action. So this delicate balance between energy security and energy transition. To explain carbon circularity, if we look at the circular carbon economy framework and the 4 pathways, the 4 R's, so reducing, reusing, recycling, and removing carbon. So under reducing, you have renewable energy, nuclear energy, energy efficiency as mechanisms to reduce carbon emissions. And under reusing and recycling carbon, the technologies such as hydrogen, different colors of hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And under removal, you have all the carbon offsetting technologies, including afforestation, nature-based solution, carbon removal. So these sets of technologies keep the options open for the energy transition to allow different national circumstances and resources endowment to participate in the energy transition without harming or disrupting economic development. I think that the current situations in the world affairs and the disruptions that are happening, from the onset of COVID-19 to the war in the Ukraine and the disruptions in the supply, give us a flavor of the cost of a disorderly energy transition. So it's important to address the question of energy security, the risk of stranded assets, and the risk of disruptions in the supply of energy. And through utilizing carbon circularity for carbon neutrality, the circular carbon economy certainly provides a win-win solution.
Absolutely. Okay, that was very interesting. And just one very final point with Mike Hayes. Now, Mario Conti, in its initial remarks, said we cannot change something if we do not measure this. And we know that decarbonization will go through also what companies, individual companies, corporations will do in terms of respect ESG criteria. But out there is this kind of a jungle of reporting standards. And we know that there's something that at the G20 they call it the data gap. So even in financial institutions want to finance somebody, they need to know exactly what the impact in terms of sustainability in the environment and climate change impact these activities do have. And still, it's very difficult and tough. What do you think is needed and where the efforts are going to fix this problem?
So I know we're nearly up against the clock, so I'll be very quick. So there's a lot of efforts going on globally to standardize the measurement and the reporting. We have the recent announcements from the US Securities and Exchange Commission, so it's kind of a TCFD measure to report on climate risk, but also on carbon accounting scope 1, 2, and 3. We have the ISSB board, which is now producing standards, and we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe. So what's actually happening, because I want to talk about something else that I think is even more significant, and these topics are well known. So there is a big push, and particularly post COP26, to align the different types of reporting standards so that we get better reporting and we get consistent reporting. Now, Andrea, something significant happened this week, and it's a different type of reporting and something that I've been predicting for quite a long time. We've been through the era of companies and countries making net zero commitments. And while commitments are great, I've always been worried about the focus on commitments, because anybody can make a commitment. It's living by that commitment and taking action. So the UK government finally this week released details of what they call climate transition plans. And this is a concept that's going to take off, not just in the UK, it will take off globally. I know the GFANZ initiative will encourage it as well. And this is where if companies want to, well, they will be obliged to do it in the UK, but it will also happen when they want to access finance. They will need to produce climate transition plans. And there's a model that's been developed by the UK. There's a task force working on it, and there's a couple of other initiatives globally as well. But for me, this is going to force companies to actually tell their stakeholders what are they doing. We are long past the day of making commitments. Now, players and companies who want to show action will need to demonstrate it in a meaningful way. And in the UK legislation, there is a requirement in the initial years to cost all of this. So this means that companies will be held to account. And for me, it's one of the most powerful measures that I've come across that I think will help move the dial quickly.
All right, fantastic. Thanks again, Mike Hayes, Noura Mansouri. Thanks again to Anthony Young, Rachel Kapka, and Lola Vallejo. It was very interesting. Thanks again. And this is the applause from Palazzo Clerici in Milan to all of you. Grazie, thanks. Thank you, Noura. All right. I think it was a very intriguing discussion that will continue with the following panel, the video, and then Nicola Monti, CEO of Edison, join me on the stage. All right, so let me introduce the speaker of this session. We've got Gun Harima, Senior Policy Fellow for Energy and Environment, Economic Research Institute for Asia and East Asia, Laura Cozzi, Chief Energy Modeler of the International Energy Agency, Samantha Smith, Director at the Just Transition Center. And here we go. Hello, welcome everyone. And together with me on the stage here, Nicola Monti, Chief Executive Officer at Edison in Italy. So Laura Cozzi, let me start with you and let's try to go straight to the point, because since we started this climate forum today, one of the main questions is what's going on in the world order, you know, with the war and so on. Do you think that at the end of the day will be kind of an acceleration factor for the energy transition? Or, as we already heard, also today, there are facts that and forces that are slowing down the process. What's your take?
Buon pomeriggio, and very, very nice to be with all of you, with some friends on the panel as well, so former colleagues, Narim and others. So let me start by stating maybe the obvious, which is after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, certainly the energy world will not look like what it was before. If we have to look ahead, I'd like to say the following, that the path that we have in front of us is really not set. So maybe let's start with some numbers and facts and figures, and then let's discuss together. First point, before starting with the very high prices that we have seen at the end of last year and beginning of this year, in 2021, we have recorded the largest ever increase in CO2 emissions that the planet has ever done. So this, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we have wiped off completely the contraction that we had during the COVID year. And despite the hopes many of us had, we are actually now at the record high level of energy emissions. Why is that? It's because already last year, many countries refueled their booming economic growth through coal. And this has been true throughout the world. It has been true mostly in developing Asia, but it has been true in Europe, it has been true in the United States, and so on. Now, what is the situation now? Currently, we wake up, especially in Europe, but in the rest of the world too, to remembering that energy security is central to energy transitions. And we suddenly understand that relying on only one or mainly on one producer is very dangerous. And I think that what's happening in Europe is very clear. We are marrying the transition towards net zero emissions and having a more reliable and secure system. Let me give you a second data point, which is we have been tracking over the past year and a half how much money governments post-COVID have been earmarking for clean energy transitions around the world. And our latest data point of end of March actually shows that up to now, so up to end of March, governments have put on the table 40% more than post the financial crisis for clean energy. This is a record. It had never happened before. Good news. But when you look at where this is happening, actually you see a very big divide emerging. One, advanced economies, Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, they have been earmarking amount of money that in our assessment by the end of 2023 is fully in line with what type of mobilization we would need to see if we were on track with net zero by 2050. This is extraordinary. So this is governments putting money on the table. We need to see where the private capital follows. So I think the previous discussion on permitting, but also I would like to stress having consumers at the center and making easier for all of us to go and retrofit our homes, buying heat pumps, buying the electric vehicle is going to be crucial. Seeing what the Repower EU has put on the table, this is clear. There is a kind of convergence in a direction. This is going to accelerate in advanced economies. What's happening in the rest of the world is not exactly the same. What we are seeing is, if you look at the amount of money that governments in emerging economies have put on the table post-COVID for green transitions, this is less than a fifth that what we would need to see for a transition to net zero at a certain point in time. Of course, the reasons are very obvious, very limited fiscal space, very emergency situation that they needed to tackle, so the money had to be spent elsewhere. Now, in the situation we are today, this amount of money that these governments will need to spend on energy, because energy is becoming extremely expensive, and to help the poorest in the societies to continue to shelter to this difficult situation, is going to take away even more money to put towards the clean energy transition. So what are we seeing on the ground? What are we seeing on the ground is very simple. There are many new coal mines being opened in China, in India, and elsewhere. There are coal-fired power plants that are being reopened, especially in those countries that have coal at home. So are we accelerating the transition? Is not that obvious yet. We are seeing certainly a resurgence of coal use that happened in 2021. And the first months of this year show even more increasing reliance on coal. So I think previously the discussion was, I think very rightly so, on looking at how do we help emerging economies to decrease the cost of capital and ensure that there is an acceleration. But in the current fiscal, economic, geopolitical situation, it is not really set in stone.
All right, thank you again. Grazie, Laura Cozzi, for this update from the International Energy Agency, which is kind of not so reassuring in terms of looking ahead, you know, the perspective in terms of climate change, but we'll get back to that because Laura Cozzi mentioned also the price that the poorest is going to pay for this, which is going underway, the highest price of energy, for example, the need to maintain shelter that the government will have to support. Now, Samantha Smith, quite often this kind of disruption or radical transformation, they just enhance the inequalities and the divergence into societies. Do you think that also energy transition will act like that, or all the measures that to make it a just transition will be effective?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Maybe I'll turn it around a little bit. We're already starting in a position, especially after a couple of years of the pandemic, disruptions in supply chains and so on, huge amounts of debt for the developing world, as Laura said, where we already have massive inequality inside of countries and between countries. And this difference between richer countries and poorer countries is just getting bigger. And that is, again, as Audrey said, in part because of the limited fiscal space that developing countries now have to do all of the things they would need to do to reduce inequality during the energy transition, and particularly during this period where the prices not only of energy, but of basically all commodities are going through the roof, right? And so we all know that these high prices, not only for energy, but also for food staples, that these are regressive. So it's poor and working class people in every country who are suffering the impacts of this, and those impacts are worse in countries that currently don't have the fiscal space to support people through this particular part of the crisis. So we have a bad starting point, right? We have a starting point where something like 90% or more of the world's workforce is actually employed in different forms of insecure and informal work. And in these gigantic global supply chains without necessarily clear employers, we have the majority of people in the world who don't have access to social protection. So like in the energy transition, if you want to avoid inequality, people will need help paying for energy. They will need income supports. They might need unemployment insurance. Many of the things that people in Europe take for granted, but that don't exist in other parts of the world. So I think the question is really more, what is it about the energy crisis? What is it about this moment of crisis that we collectively can use to do something about this massive crisis of inequality that pre-existed not only the war, not only the beginnings of the energy transition, and not only COVID. There are, I don't want to say that everything is bleak, right? There are, for example, calls, and the International Trade Union Confederation, where I work, representing 200 million organized workers in 162 countries. We and many others are calling for debt relief for developing countries, especially in this moment of crisis, with very high basic commodities prices around the world. So that would be one moment of light, that there's a recognition that something needs to happen with the debt burden of developing countries. I think the other growing recognition that we're seeing, and we're seeing this both in developed, but also in some developing countries, is that the energy transition has to be all about jobs. A just transition is not a just transition unless it involves people with rights at work and good jobs. It's based on social dialogue between employers, workers in our organizations, usually trade unions, and sometimes government. And it produces these plans for good jobs that we desperately need around the world right now. And the reason why having good jobs can do something about inequality is because in some countries, a single good formal job can support as many as 10 people. They have a very high leverage effect on inequality.
Yeah.
So we want to see more governments, more employers entering into social dialogue for these plans for just transition. And we want to see a super tight focus on creating good jobs in the energy transition. As we like to say in the labor movement, there need to be new jobs and they need to be good jobs.
Thanks again, Samantha Smith. Now let's move to the industry point of view in Nicola Monti. Welcome again. Nicola Monti, you are the head of an energy group like Edison in Italy. And before the war started, you were full force into energy transition. So you're working both in traditional energy, but you were projected towards transition. First of all, have your plans changed given what's happening? And how do you see the medium and long-term impact of the Ukrainian war?
No, I share most of the views which were presented during the scenario session, and which most probably what's happening now, including the war in Ukraine, will probably accelerate the development of renewables, because we need to diversify our dependence on hydrocarbons, and that's part of the energy transition path. But also we need to diversify from Russian supplies. So one path is accelerating on renewables, and in doing that, there are several challenges. So there's a technological challenge, because if we want to decarbonize fully our economy, it means net zero 2050, we need to address our efforts toward innovation and technologies that are not currently known. So we can invest massively in solar and wind, in the technologies that we know and which are already available and competitive, but those technologies will not be enough to reach the targets at 2050. The colleagues before me of KPMG mentioned the issue of technology, and it's really a challenge that we need to address because there's an effort to be done in developing other sources of energy that currently are not developed at industrial standard. Maybe nuclear, maybe fusion, maybe hydrogen, maybe carbon capture with production of solid carbon, maybe whatever, maybe new batteries.
How far are these innovations in terms of when they will help us in this direction?
I think we're investing, all the industries invest in a lot of efforts and capital in innovation, which never happened in the past. And I think history has proved that we can scale up technologies which currently are just at a testing phase and make them available in 10 years from now, probably. Hydrogen can be one of those, but all the others that I mentioned may also be. We're also investing. A single company cannot make the difference, so we need to invest maybe in venture capital. Maybe we need to cooperate more and address our investment all together and try to identify technologies in which we can make the difference at regional level. So concentrating the supply chains at regional level, maybe in Europe. One of the examples on the technology in which EU is still leader is wind turbine. So still European industry is world leader in wind power generation. Not in solar panels, definitely. We're purchasing most of our panels today from China, but then we have to, and we are doing research and investing in new products and materials which could improve performances of a solar panel by 20 to 30%.
Yeah. But to accelerate on this road, well, normally if you want to accelerate, you've got to have an open road, a visible road ahead of you. And when it comes to new projects and investments, especially in the renewables, I'm talking about Italy. We both know pretty well the situation. The road is not that open. I mean, it's blocked sometimes. What's your experience? And do you have investments that are actually stalled, given, bureaucracy, authorization, and all of the rest?
Quite a few. It's a matter of culture. So I think in the past 20 years, we lived in a world in which energy was largely available, and okay, there's energy transition ahead of us, but we're not in a hurry. So we could afford to say no to a lot of investment and infrastructure, but now we need to get rid of that. I mean, the government is doing the right steps in this direction at the moment. They have put in place a dedicated commission just to approve the environmental works which are needed to finally implement and invest in renewables. We're just seeing now the effect of this effort, but it's not enough. So we need to change the culture at the central level, but even at a regional level. So territories and needs to be able to accept installations, wind and solar, whatever is needed in their territory. We cannot anymore go ahead by saying no to anything. We're not going anywhere in that respect. The other thing is that we need to invest. I was talking about changing culture. Also, we need to change the culture of our customers. Energy efficiency can help us in saving 30% roughly of energy consumption. So it's really a very powerful tool which we need in addition to investing more and more in renewables to reduce our energy
efficiency or less demand, so destruction of demand because...
Energy efficiency basically And also we need to change, when I'm talking about culture, is the culture on the consumer side. That again, energy is not, as it was in the past 30 years, something largely available and very cheap. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that today, and the situation of today is probably going to last for a while. So every large consumer, but even the residential consumer, need to understand that it can help reducing its carbon footprint by investing in energy efficiency.
Yeah, I would have many questions, on the Italian specific side, but this is a global forum of climate change. So let me move back to Unarima and Eastern Asia. We know it's one of the fastest growing economy globally, and also one of the feel the most the need to find the right strike and balance between economic growth and sustainability. Where are you in the region, and what's your sense of what's going on?
Thank you. And I feel that there has been always big gap between the COP narrative and energy reality in the Asian region in particular. And as Lola rightly pointed out, the dependence on fossil fuel in this region is very high, and our organization area is periodically producing energy outlook, taking into account the information we have got from other member states. And in the business as usual scenario, the dependence on fossil fuel by 2050 is still, say, between 70 and 80%. Amazing figure. And so I think it would be very difficult and so unrealistic to talk about a complete phase out of fossil fuel in this region in the next 2 or 3 decades. And a couple of reasons. First of all, the priority on climate action in this region is not top priority, unlike many European or US or developed countries. For example, in the case of China, according to the global poll conducted by United Nations, the priority on climate action was 15th out of 17 SDGs in China. And in Indonesia, 9th out of 17. So climate action has not been the top priority even before COVID-19 and Ukraine war. And this situation must have further exacerbated because of the two, crises. And also, in this developing region, there is a strong resistance to high energy prices. And even in developed countries under energy crisis, for example, in Japan, we have decided to increase the subsidy to gasoline. So that is a political reality. And such a resistance is even stronger in developing countries, in developing Asian region with lower per capita income. And in Asia, whenever we have a discussion about energy policies, ASEAN countries, a keyword is affordability. Affordability always comes first in these countries. So the current, energy crisis is not conducive to energy transition. And also, what I'm concerned is in the Asian region, there has been a big debate that switching from coal to natural gas is a low-hanging fruit for lower CO2 emissions in this region. So there was a lot of expectation to wider usage of natural gas, not only in power sector, but also in industrial sector. But because of the gas crisis, there was of energy. So that will increase energy price, then that could delay the fuel switching from coal to natural gas. So perhaps I think increasing number of Asian countries might continue to use coal power plant, and they might change the plan of constructing natural gas power plant to coal power plant because of the availability of coal resources in their own country. And more broadly, the one more thing is, since Western countries are increasing military expense to cope with a geopolitical challenge, and that could crowd out the financial assistance to developing countries, which are very much highly expected from developing countries in the forthcoming COP27. So I think COP27 debate could be a very, the difficult one because of the, difficulty for providing more financial resources to developing countries. Remember, Prime Minister Modi of India said that developed countries should pay $1 trillion every year instead of the $100 billion US dollar from the current target. And finally, because of the Ukraine crisis and Ukraine war, I think international order is going towards more divided one. And climate change agenda has been flourishing in parallel with the end of Cold War. And there has been a very wide euphoria that international collaboration could go forward. But under this divided world, such agenda as climate change, which truly needs the international collaboration, might be challenged. So, since I'm in Asia, my expectation is getting a bit more pessimistic looking at the current situation. Thank
Absolutely. You. Yes, Khun Arima, I personally do think this is the main concern because we need more cooperation, but in a world where countries look at each other with suspect or even as enemies, it will be difficult to maintain dialogue open, even as it was before. During the Italian G20, some progress has been made, but now the climate is different. So let me move back to Laura Cozzi, because here Nicola Monti said we have to accelerate on renewables, but when it comes to renewables, what we gather when we interview people, from the market, from the industry, from also analysts, is sometimes that renewable will not just fix the problem, because they mention intermittency, for example, or they mention the fact that it will take time for us to get to a level of renewable production that can, compete or catch up with what we want to leave in terms of decarbonization. What do you make, and what's your view on the role that actually renewables can play to help us in the future?
So in our analysis, in a world that meets climate targets, basically we would need to see a quadrupling of installation of solar and wind compared to what we actually have seen last year. Is it large as a number? Actually, quadrupling is something that the industry has done in the previous decade too. Are we on track to this quadrupling? No, not yet, but we are seeing very steady increases of both solar and wind on the basis of the fact that they are becoming cheaper and cheaper. So I think it's a fact that renewables are going to be rolled out even at a faster pace. The question is how quickly. Now, what we are seeing in Europe, I'd like to give one data point. On Sunday, I'm in Belgium now. Belgium and the Netherlands had negative prices of electricity. We were trading at minus 60 euros at kilowatt hour. In France, plus 200. Why were these negative prices here? So we're actually paying mostly industrial consumers to use electricity. Why? Because there was a very sunny day and windy off the coast of both Belgium and the Netherlands. Offshore wind farms have been built over the past few years, and this was benefiting consumers. So the more we move towards the transition, the more all analyses show there will be many more hours of zero or negative prices. What do we need to fix is being able to fix the flexibility problem. This is a technical issue that TSOs and DSOs know how to fix. However, in some cases, there is not the market design yet to incentivize the flexibility investments. What are those investments? This is transmission lines, grids, it is batteries, it is being able to have demand-side response, it is being able to actually use the current thermal plant in a much more flexible way, including nuclear. Now, much more focus should be paid to this, which seems a very, very technical issue, but it's going to be fundamental to keep the lights on. Now, I just would like to underline one thing, just to have it said, I think, the record straight. The high electricity prices we are seeing in Europe today are a natural gas crisis. It's not an energy transition crisis. It's a natural gas crisis.
Yeah, very interesting. Nicola Monti, do you agree this is a natural gas crisis, and how serious it is looking ahead.
I fully agree with what Laura Cozzi mentioned. It's definitely the gas crisis, and what shows us is that we still need gas. I disagree with some of the previous speakers saying that we have to stop immediately investing in gas because it has a carbon footprint. It is not. We need to guarantee a smooth transition, and to guarantee that, we need to still make use of gas. Russia is supplying a third of gas needs in Europe, is 150 BCM a year. We need to replace that, so we need to do an additional effort in investing and supplying gas from different sources. I won't say to replace completely the quota of Russian gas supply, but to replace part of Russian gas supply, which we will not be able to offset immediately with all the additional investment we're doing in renewables and in energy efficiency. So diversification, there are several opportunities around the world for the benefit of Europe, but also for the benefit of developing countries which cannot get rid of gas in the very short term.
But just looking at the short term, because yesterday we had the chance to speak with the Italian governor of the central bank, Ignazio Visco, and he said in an interview, well, if we had to stop importing gas from Russia, the Italian economy might risk to go in recession, even in a mild recession, but this is a risk. But from the energy standpoint, what if we stop and we close, the tube at Tarvisio and then stop? Can we manage that, and what the consequences might be?
No, we will be in an energy deficit for the next 3 or 4 years. So the time lag which is required in order to make additional investment to replace part of the Russian gas. We can, of course, reduce at the minimum the existing quota of Russian supply, reducing consumptions in the industrial sector, reducing the temperature in our buildings during the winter period. But that's not the most efficient way then to sustain the economy. So it definitely could trigger a recession at that point in time. So we have ahead of us 2 or 3 years in which if Russians are going to stop supply, or we're going to choose to stop Russian supply, we will be in trouble.
Laura Cozzi said, we have to quadruple the investments in renewables. Is that possible? Is that a possibility?
Is that possible? But what Laura rightly said is not simply installing 4 times more wind or solar supply, but we have to invest in a balancing system. We need to balance the interruptibility of renewable sources. A wind or a solar plant runs for maximum 2,000 hours per year, but we have 8,760 hours a year. So we need to have programmable sources to balance the system to guarantee availability of
Well, we do
energy.
have one renewable you can plant, which is hydroelectric, and in Italy is quite relevant because kind of 40% of all the Italian renewables comes from hydroelectric.
Even 50, yeah. So it's something that we need to relaunch in terms of investment. There are investment available that all the
Are you ready to invest?
We, as all the other current manager of hydroelectric plants, are ready to invest. There's about 10 billion euros investment ready in order to improve efficiency and make available also the
At what conditions?
To improve the conditions, those plants have an average 60 to 70 years of
No, I mean,
of
at
activity.
what conditions will you
Well, the
actually
conditions would be
invest?
to have the proper visibility of the duration of the concessions in order to recover those investments.
Which is under discussion.
Which is under discussion. It's a huge discussion that we're having currently with the government. Italy has declared that they want to launch an auction program to renew the concessions on hydro, but we would be at the point in time the sole country in Europe to do that. And what we need today is to give more value to those assets, and the best way to do it is to leave the current owners and managers of those plants to develop the investment required.
Yeah, okay, I understand that the industry in general here in Italy is asking to kind of 10 more years of the concession.
At least 10 more years,
10 more years
to recover.
To invest and to face the transition in the emergency which is underway that has to be put into the equation.
Right.
Now, let me get back to Samantha Smith to wrap it up with your view of how cooperation between institutions and so on can help also tackle the differences that inequalities, the topic that we were mentioning, connected with energy transition, which is global, but then hits also inside any country.
Well, I mean, we're hearing discussions about really massive amounts of public and also private investment, but let's make no mistake about it. You will see public money leading private money in a lot of these investments. And we have also seen during the COVID crisis, and now as, for example, Europe remilitarizes, that when our governments want to have funds for things, they actually do have them and they're ready to deploy them. So, this is an opportunity to make sure that all of the hundreds of thousands and really more like millions of jobs that are going to be created in this massive expansion of everything from grids and dispatching systems to port infrastructure, to mining, to steel production, to wind turbine production, and so on, that all of that money creates good jobs. Now, the World Bank, of all people, and the International Labor Organization partnered to produce a new report on balancing regulation. So basically making sure that IFI funding actually targets the creation of good jobs. And we're seeing a similar approach in a lot of governments, some in Europe, but strangely enough, the United States, also the administration is really trying to push good job creation with rights, with decent wages, with health and pension and so on, as kind of the backbone of any action it takes on climate. So we see something similar to that in Canada and also in countries like South Africa, where any kind of just transition, any transition in their power sector is going to have to be based on good jobs. Otherwise, it will be politically unacceptable. So others see a need to quadruple efforts. They see trillions of investment that are needed in order to phase out dependency on polluting industries. And we see the potential to create many good jobs if governments across the board attach labor and rights strings to this public funding that is going to be the backbone of the energy transition going forward.
Thanks, Samantha.
That is entirely possible to do, but it does require also a new approach from many governments as well as from some employers. So we see a big opportunity. We hope that people are ready to seize it.
Thanks again, Samantha Smith. Kounarima, I've got my final question for you, which is about two relevant countries also for pollution and for the economy, which are China and India. I can still remember the frustration of the Italian government during the G20 in Rome, when basically President Narendra Modi came here and said, I cannot sign any engagement in terms of reducing 1.5 Celsius degrees in terms of enhancing of temperature, and then flew to Glasgow saying, our year it's 2017 instead of 2050. And President Xi didn't even flew out of China. And, we know China is skeptic on one hand, on decarbonization, on the other hand, want to become a leader in terms of production of different new green technologies. So what's your sense of how the dialogue with these two huge, enormous countries for their impact, for the people that live in these countries can have? How can we dialogue, and what's the position you can take?
Thank you very much. And it is a really headache. And, as you pointed out, China and India consider that their national interest is a top priority, and they are not interested in the altruistic mitigation for the sake of global environment. And also, they think that their target, 2060 for China and 2070 for India, is consistent with Paris Agreement. because Paris Agreement says we are aiming at 1.5 degrees, and we are aiming at carbon neutrality by the second half of this century, not necessarily 2050. So from that viewpoint, developed country has moved the goalpost from 1.52 to 1.5, and in the second half of this century to 2050. So we cannot envisage that they would revise their target by the end of this year, as expected in COP26 in Glasgow. And European countries might consider that carbon border adjustment could be a potential driver for persuading those two countries. But I do not agree with that kind of argument, because carbon border adjustment measures could potentially target all the developing countries with high CO2 intensity. And China and India would definitely say that in the United Nations Framework Convention, there is a clear provision that climate change should not be used as a disguised protectionism. So they will be very much furious if developed countries impose carbon border tariff to those countries, and they could potentially retaliate. So that could lead to trade war, and that could give the world economy further downward pressure. And in addition, calculating embedded CO2 emissions is really, really difficult. So that is why the carbon border adjustment measures is now focusing on limited sectors such as steel, cement, and fertilizer and electricity. Relatively simple production process. But I think, rather than imposing such a, carbon tariff, I think more, cooperative approach. For example, to increase the transparency of, traded CO2, how to calculate embedded CO2 emissions in certain product, and how to disclose data. That kind of transparency initiative, China and India cannot, say no to this sort of initiative, because we are not talking about imposition of carbon tariff. We are just simply talking about transparency. And nobody can deny the importance of transparency, because MRV is one of the keywords of the climate dialogue. And if global companies, procure the products with, the certain level of carbon intensity or embedded CO2 emissions, such as, the Global Compact, that might incentivize those two countries to go towards more low carbon future. But I think this sort of more cooperative approach would be more fruitful rather than punitive actions, which is under consideration by European Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnarina. And I think we're done with the panel, but Nicola Monti, just the final question on an Italian issue, because in a couple of days, on Monday, the government will launch a new decree to face the energy crisis. What do you expect, and what do you think could be more useful to help families, companies, and the economy to tackle with these enormous challenge?
Well, certainly to continue accelerating the possibility to invest and talking about private investments in renewables. We need still to accelerate on that, to put aside the bureaucracy.
Do we need a commissioner for facilitating investments in renewables?
Maybe. I think the current special committee, which has been installed at the ministry level, it's working. It's starting giving its feedback positively. I think we need to give them the time to be able then to be more productive.
Do you think that a cap price on gas is possible in Europe or at the national level?
If it has to be at Europe level, because we are living in an integrated market, and it could be, but it's not simple, because, well, from one side, the current market design is not set, it is true, in order to manage those volatility and those high prices, and also the fact that gas is fixing the price of electricity with the system marginal price that we have. But then changing completely the market design for the effect that we're seeing due to the war which is not something going to last, hopefully, for a long time, probably is not the best way. Fixing a cap in may be. The cap on gas can be effective linked to supply of gas via pipeline to the European platform. But then the risk is that we cannot attract LNG, which has different options that come into Europe and maybe going to Far East if prices are higher.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
So
a global,
not an
global
easy,
market.
It's a global market. So it's not an easy task, but I think at a certain point in time, if those high prices goes ahead for a while, then I think an intervention is required.
Well, definitely. And my bottom line is that there are no simple solutions for complicated problems like these, but there are solutions, and that's what we discussed also during the panel. Thanks again to Laura Cozzi, Samantha Smith, Gunnar Rima, and Nicola Monti. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And we're ready for our closing remarks session right after the video. So I think that during our forum on climate change, we had a very broad and comprehensive discussion. We discussed a lot of aspects. It's difficult to get to the bottom line, but we will try to do this with Luis de Mello, Director of the Policy Study Branch of Economics Department of the OECD. And you can see on the screen also Muekti Andarjani Soe Jacmoen, co-founder and executive director of the Indonesian Research Institute for Decarbonization. As you know, Indonesia owns the G20, so she's lead co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Governing Climate Target, Energy Transition, and Environmental Protection. Welcome both. Luis de Mello, I would start with you asking what's your sense at the OECD of the economic impact of the crisis we're living, and also from an energy perspective and climate change perspective, what's your takeaway?
Thank you very much, Andrea. Great to be with you today, and great to be on this panel with my good friend Kuki. This is a great question, Andrea. I think what came up in the discussions today, it's very clear that the world is going through a very serious energy crisis as a result of the war in Ukraine. We know that energy prices have risen very sharply, and they have also become more volatile since the onset of the war, especially, obviously, in Europe. In terms of economic effects, it's interesting to note that the Ukraine and Russia are very small, economically speaking. They account for about 2% of world GDP, but they are very important producers and exporters of commodities beyond energy, as became clear in the conversations today. They account together for about 30% of global exports of wheat, 20% of exports of corn, mineral, fertilizers, natural gas, some 10% of oil. So they are big in those markets. And supply chains around the world are also dependent on exports of metals from Russia and Ukraine. Palladium, nickel are a few examples of that dependence. So the disruptions that we've seen so far in those markets, because of that, the war will likely result in a substantial drag on global growth, and also stronger inflationary pressures than we had anticipated before. Just to give you an example, before the war, we were expecting our economies to grow fairly robustly. They were growing strongly, despite the effects of the pandemic. Everything was pointing towards a return to normality during the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In December, so only a few months ago, in our economic outlook, we were projecting global GDP to grow by about 4.5% this year, and just above 3% next year. We're expecting inflation to be in the neighborhood of 3.5% this year. So numbers that are, very, very old now, as you can imagine, as a result of these dramatic developments. We did some simulations of what the economic impact might be of the war. We published them, about a month ago, and the outcome of that was that if you took into account the effects that we observed on energy prices in general, the shock to activity in Russia and Ukraine. If we maintain that, what we observed in the initial weeks of the conflict, the global economy could lose about 1 percentage point in growth this year. This is not a small impact. Inflation could rise by over 2 percentage points this year as a result of that. And obviously, the European economies would be collectively hardest hit, particularly those who have stronger ties with Russia and Ukraine. Another point I'd like to make is that obviously there is substantial uncertainty about the duration, the intensity of the conflict. So it's very difficult to be absolutely sure about the long-term economic and social impacts, especially the longer-term scarring effects of this crisis in different parts of the world. And this is, of course, over and above the humanitarian crisis that we are witnessing already. Let's not forget, nearly 5 million people have already fled Ukraine. So a huge humanitarian crisis as well. But all the long-term effects that we may consider will depend, by and large, on how well we manage the crisis at the moment. And then several points come to mind. Some of them have been mentioned already. Take, for instance, I just mentioned the humanitarian crisis. Take the refugee situation. Supporting refugees from Ukraine and also sharing the burden of that support will require government spending on housing, on food, medical assistance, childcare, schooling, in addition to the immediate cost of absorbing those displaced populations. Another point, the importance of minimizing dependence on Russia for key energy imports. A lot has been talked about it today, so I'm not going to repeat that. But this is essentially about improving the security of energy supply in Europe. It's a medium-term endeavor. Several aspects related to it are complex, but there are also a number of short-term gains that can be achieved, and we heard about those as well throughout the conversation. But also beyond the energy, let's not forget the food crisis, the food security issues around this, rising prices, lower exports of wheat, for instance, from Russia and Ukraine, could result in serious shortages in many emerging markets and developing countries. That could lead to a sharp increase in poverty, in hunger. The disruption in fertilizer manufacturing risks making these disruptions more lasting by putting next year's agricultural supply under stress. So another aspect that we needed to consider now, in many countries in the Middle East, for instance, wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine represent really the lion's share of their wheat imports. So a very, very important aspect of regional shocks that are also very unequal in different parts of the world.
Absolutely.
And I'll conclude here, Andrea, by just making one point about some other possible longer-term consequences of the war that have to do, for instance, with the pressures for higher spending on defense, the structure of energy markets that we just heard from the last panel, a potential fragmentation of payment systems, changes in the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves. What's at stake here is the risk of a redivision of the world into blocks that are separated by barriers. And if that is the case, there is a lot that will, a lot of costs that we need to bear in mind. Costs related to a loss in specialization, economies of scale, the diffusion of information, know-how. So this is another aspect that needs to be borne in mind as we factor in all the potential implications of the war. But it has been a great conversation today. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I'm sure we will all meet again to discuss further about some of these issues.
We too, Luis de Melo. Thanks again also for your concluding remarks. And what was very interesting to me, your final point, the risk that even the soonest the guns and missiles and the war will be silenced, but fragmentation and deglobalization of the economy will be one of the major risks in terms of economic growth and also imbalances and asymmetric prices of this crisis between countries and inside the countries. And with that, I move to Mehdi Andejani Soheh-Jacquemin, and I trained all the week to take it right, but I'm sorry if I took it wrong. But as the lead of the T20 task force on governing climate target and energy transition, can you tell us which are the main topics you are focusing on and the main results of the dialogue with the stakeholders you're having?
Okay, thank you, Andrea, and no worry, you just do it right. And in fact, people usually call me Cookie, so just call me Cookie.
Okay, next time I will.
And thank you also for ISPI for having me, inviting me and having me in this session. As you already mentioned earlier, Andrea, that the task force that I am leading at the moment has a very long, name and a great, quite broad coverage. So it's not only about climate, but it's also about energy. And on top of that, it's also about environmental issues. So, but we see that all those things are basically closely related one to each other. And I think it is necessary for us to address it in a very comprehensive manner. And for the T20 itself, so right now we are in the process of reviewing a number of draft policy briefs coming from authors from around the world. And key messages from those policy briefs will be formulated and will be part of T20 as a whole, input to the G20 communique. And if you ask me about what are the issues or the area that becoming our focus, of course, one or maybe the biggest issue will be to be aligned with the 3 priority issues of the Indonesia G20 presidency, which is the sustainable energy transition. And for that issue, then from the discussion as well as from the policy brief that we got so far, one of the topics will be issues related to financing. So in this financing, we are financing about sustainable energy transition, and this will related to de-risking of investment, for example, as well as regional financing cooperation. Another element for the energy transition will be the role of energy transition itself in achieving net zero emission. And this can be done through both global framework as well as regional cooperation. And another issues will be, of course, related to climate change. And this will be definitely talking about net zero emission, where we also have, role of cities beside the role of the energy sector. And also we have some input on the climate financing, especially it's not only about the, the promise of developed countries, but also how to increase the capacity of financial institutions in emerging economies itself, because even though the money is there, if the capacity of financial institutions is not there, then we might still have issues in disbursing the money, right? And of course, the role of circular economy is also another area. This is both for addressing the climate issues, especially in mitigating the greenhouse gases emission. And also there is also one interesting proposals on circular economy of battery, which may be able to address the issue that raised earlier by Anthony Nyong. So let's see how we can come up with, like the result of that discussion later. And also the nexus of climate, water, energy, and food has been raised as well. And this is not only on the mitigation part of climate change, but also more importantly, I think on the impacts and the adaptation actions that needed to address those nexus. And then another area, of course, because it's also in Indonesia, then we have issues of marine, coastal and marine ecosystem, both for addressing climate issues, and also energy transition in a way, because we are also talking about marine fuels, but also there is something a lot to do with marine pollutions. And last but not least, we have heard earlier from Rachel Kapka as well. This is about environmental protection. It's about addressing the transboundary pollutions, especially on air pollution, both for health issues, but also on the environmental, on the climate-related impact.
Well, it's a very plenty agenda also for your task force. And so good luck to the Indonesian G20 and T20. And good work. Thanks again, Mukti, and also thanks to Luis de Mello. All right, so I think thanks for your closing remarks both. And this is the applause from here, ISPI in Milan. Well, I simply think it was a very special edition on the Forum on Climate Change, Rescuing Green Transition. We know that the first thoughts are for the population to rescue in front of the war. We hope and pray for the soonest end of the conflict. But what we discussed today are longer-term impact on the economy and the fight to climate change. Energy is and will remain at the center of this. You will find the highlights of the conference on the social and digital platform of ISPI and also on our channel Class CNBC, where daily we discuss this in a special program, Sustainable Future. So thanks again for attending here, and hello to all of you that have followed in the remote control in streaming. Thanks again. Bye-bye. Take care.